Her Secret Garden of Sin. Chapter 1, The Observer. London felt heavy tonight, a thick, suffocating mix of coal smoke, expensive perfume, and people trying way too hard to be important. Evelyn St. stood by her window in Mayfair, her fingers tracing the cold glass, as she watched the carriages roll by. To the rest of the wealthy elite, it was a grand parade of status. To Evelyn, it felt like a cage. She was 22, which in her world meant her only job was to find a husband. But Evelyn had a secret that would ruin her reputation if anyone found out. She was obsessed with collecting forbidden things, rare, lethal plants that most people were terrified to even touch. She tucked a small, leather-bound book into the hidden pocket of her dress. It wasn't filled with poems or gossip like a normal girl's diary. It was packed with messy sketches of flowers that could stop a heart, and notes on how to use them. To her father, she was just a debutante waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. To herself, she was a woman playing a dangerous game. "You're brooding again, Evie," a voice teased from the doorway. Evelyn turned, her guard going up. Her brother, Julian, leaned against the frame with a playful, knowing smirk. "I'm not brooding, Julian. I'm just watching. Watching because you'd rather be anywhere but the Duchess's ball tonight. A pity. I heard the Earl of Ashworth is back. They say he's incredibly rich, and has a coldness about him that makes every woman in London want to be the one to break through his shell." Evelyn felt a flash of annoyance. "I have no interest in thawing out an earl. I only care that I'm expected to be stuck dancing until I can't feel my feet anymore." "Life is all about compromises, sister," Julian murmured, walking over to her. "Just go to the party. Look pretty. Be the perfect daughter father wants. Maybe you'll find a man who prefers secrets to small talk." Evelyn turned back to the window, ready to snap back at him, when her breath caught in her throat. A sleek, black carriage had just pulled up to the old, abandoned estate across the street. A man stepped out. His movements were smooth and confident, and his dark coat was tailored to fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He didn't carry himself like the silly, pampered guise she was used to. He moved like a man who thrived on danger. He didn't even glance at his own front door. Instead, he looked up, his gaze locking directly onto hers through the glass. Evelyn should have ducked behind the curtains. It was the safe thing to do. Instead, she stood frozen, caught by an intensity that felt like a sudden, hot breeze in a cold, stuffy room. He didn't bow or act like a gentleman. He simply tipped his hat, his lips curling into a slow, knowing smile that seemed to see right through her silk dress to the wild, curious heart beating underneath. Then, he vanished inside the house. Evelyn felt her heart pounding, not with the polite, fluttering nerves of a girl at a party, but with the dangerous, electric thrill of someone who had just found their next big temptation. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Who moved into the house across the way?" Julian walked to the window, frowning as he looked out. That's the old Thorne estate. It's been empty and dead for 10 years. Why?" Evelyn didn't answer. She couldn't. She stayed glued to the window, staring at the closed door of the Thorne house. The ball tonight was no longer just a boring chore. It was a challenge, and she had just found the only man worth the risk. Chapter 2, The Midnight Knock. The Duchess's ball was a blur of sweating bodies, suffocating perfume, and the mindless chatter of people who would never understand the fire burning behind Evelyn's ribs. She spent 2 hours trapped in a corner with a man who talked for 40 minutes about his new hunting dogs, his voice buzzing like a trapped fly. Every time she looked across the room, her gaze flicked to the ballroom entrance, waiting for the dark-coated man from across the street. He never came. At midnight, with the clock striking a heavy, mournful tone that vibrated through the floorboards, Evelyn made her move. She slipped away from her brother, ducked through the kitchen servant's entrance, and ignored the scandalized gasp of a passing maid. She didn't head for the stables. She hiked her heavy silk skirts up to her knees and ran through the damp, dark streets of Mayfair, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. When she reached the Thorne estate, the house loomed over her, a dark, jagged silhouette against the moonlight. The gates were locked, but the iron was rusted and brittle. With a sharp grunt of effort, she climbed, the metal biting into her palms, until she dropped into the overgrown, tangled mess of the front garden. She didn't stop at the front door. She knew exactly where she was going, the side of the house, where the old, glass-walled extension sat bathed in a strange, flickering violet light. She crept closer, her breath hitching as she peered through the grime-streaked glass. The room inside wasn't a library, or a drawing room. It was a jungle. Exotic, dark-leaved plants she had only ever read about in forbidden travel journals spiraled up towards the ceiling. And there, standing in the center of the madness, was the man. He was stripped to his shirt sleeves, his white linen stained with earth and sweat. He was holding a glass vial, carefully dripping a glowing, neon blue liquid onto the roots of a flower that looked like a bruised human heart. He wasn't just gardening, he was experimenting. He was playing God. Evelyn reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold glass, but she lost her footing on the wet mulch. She slipped, her hand slamming against the pane with a loud, unmistakable thud. The man went dead still. He didn't look around. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, his back to her, and spoke in a voice that cut through the night air like a razor blade. "I've been expecting you, Miss St. Clair. But I must say, I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to come alone." Evelyn froze. He knew her name. He knew who she was. And before she could even turn to run, the side door clicked open, and the scent of damp earth and something dark and spicy flooded the air. "Since you've already broken into my sanctuary," the man said, turning slowly to face her, his eyes burning with a dangerous, hungry intelligence, "you might as well come inside and see exactly how lethal my vices really are." Chapter 3, The Taste of Danger. Evelyn stepped over the threshold, the air inside the conservatory thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and crushed petals. The man, Arthur Thorne, didn't move to stop her. He watched her with a predator's patience, his gaze tracing the way her silk gown clung to her frame from the damp night air. "You're shivering," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "Is it the cold, or the realization that you're finally where you belong?" He walked toward her, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He didn't reach for her, instead, he plucked a single, dark purple leaf from a nearby vine and held it out. "This plant produces a nectar that makes the senses sharpen, then drowns them in pleasure. It's what I'm studying. Care for a taste?" Chapter 4, The Game of Secrets. Evelyn took the leaf, her fingers brushing his. She knew it was madness, but she took a bite. The effect was immediate, the wall tilted, the colors of the conservatory turning more vivid, his eyes seeming to hold 1,000 secrets she was dying to uncover. "You're not a botanist," she whispered, her head spinning. "You're an alchemist. You're playing with forces the Royal Society would burn you for." Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold, sharp, and entirely focused on her. "The Royal Society is a collection of dusty men who fear what they can't control. I, however, have no such fear. Tell me, Evelyn, what would you give to know the secrets of the world?" Chapter 5, The Midnight Pact. "I'd give anything," she admitted, the truth tearing out of her before she could stop it. The nectar was doing its work, lowering every wall she had spent her life building. Arthur stepped closer, his hand coming up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering on the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of ownership, and she didn't flinch. "Then we have a bargain," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr. "You provide the access to the noble houses, to the information I need, and I will teach you the things that no man would ever dare show a lady." But be warned, once you see what I do, there is no going back to your cotillions. Chapter 6, A Double Life. The days that followed were a blur of high society masquerades and midnight lessons in the conservatory. Evelyn learned to lie with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, playing the perfect debutante by day while her hands were stained with dirt and exotic serums by night. Julian noticed the change, the way she seemed to burn with a private, secret fire, but he didn't intervene. He saw the way she looked at the Thorne estate, and he saw the way Arthur Thorne watched her from across the street, like a man who had finally caught the star he'd been chasing. Chapter 7, The Royal Society's Shadow. The danger became real when a local magistrate began sniffing around the Thorne estate. He'd heard rumors of unnatural lights and strange odors drifting from the old place. During one of their late-night sessions, Arthur pulled her into the shadows as a guard's lantern swung past the glass. They were pressed tight against the damp stone wall, his hand firmly on her waist to keep her still. The proximity was intoxicating, the smell of him, the sheer weight of his presence. "They suspect you," she whispered, her breath hitching. "If they find your research, they'll hang you." Arthur looked down at her, his expression darkening. "Let them try. I have more than just plants to protect me." Chapter 8, The Poisoned Pen. Evelyn discovered that one of her father's friends, a man who frequented the society meetings, was actually the one funding the investigation into Arthur. She realized the conspiracy went deeper than just botany. It was about control, about silencing anyone who dared to experiment outside of the approved channels. She had to act. She gathered the information from her father's study, the ink smudging on her fingers, as she realized she was effectively betraying her own blood for the man who was showing her the world. Chapter 9, The Garden's Bloom. The garden began to thrive under their combined efforts. They successfully managed to breed a plant that could synthesize its own light, a breakthrough that defied every law of nature she had ever been taught. Arthur watched her work, his eyes filled with a new kind of intensity, something that wasn't just professional respect. It was a hunger. "You have a gift, Evelyn," he said, taking the vial from her hands. "Most women are taught to be decorations. You were born to be a force of nature." He kissed her then, not a gentle, soft debutante's kiss, but something fierce, tasting of crushed herbs and raw, unspoken desire. Chapter 10, The Trap is Sprung. The Duke finally noticed her absences. He didn't know about Arthur, but he knew something was changing. He began inviting more suitors to the house, holding dinners every night, trying to force her into a marriage that would tie her to the manor. Evelyn felt the walls closing in. She knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. She had to decide, the life she was born into, or the life Arthur was building in the dark. Chapter 11, The Duke's Discovery. The trap snapped shut on a Tuesday. Evelyn returned from the Thorne estate just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, her dress still carrying the faint, earthy scent of the conservatory. She didn't notice the Duke standing in the library doorway until it was too late. He held her notebook, the one with the sketches of the poisonous aconitum, and the notes on Arthur's illicit experiments. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. "I thought you were studying flowers, Evelyn," he said, his voice deathly quiet. "But this is not science. This is heresy. And you have been consorting with a man who is actively working to dismantle everything this family stands for." Chapter 12, The Lockdown. Evelyn was not allowed to leave the house. Her father confiscated her keys, her books, and even her shoes, locking her in her suite. She sat by the window, watching the Thorne estate, hoping for a sign, but the house remained dark, silent as a tomb. Julian managed to sneak into her room under the cover of night, his face grim. "He's gone, Evie," he whispered. "The authorities raided the estate. They smashed the glass. They tore the plants from the soil. And they took him to Newgate prison. Father had a hand in it, he wanted him erased." Chapter 13, The Descent. The news shattered her. Newgate was a place where people went to die. She didn't cry, she became ice. She knew how to extract the essence of the flowers they had been studying. She knew exactly what would render a guard unconscious, and she knew the precise amount of the nectar Arthur had used to sharpen his senses. She began to play the part of the broken, obedient daughter, letting the Duke believe he had finally crushed her spirit. She even agreed to meet the Baron she was supposed to marry, using the dinner as a distraction to gather what she needed. Chapter 14, The Midnight Heist. Julian didn't ask questions. He provided the distractions while Evelyn raided her father's wine cellar, not for wine, but for the heavy metal vials and the potent, unrefined alcohol she needed to stabilize her mixtures. She worked in her room, a miniature laboratory hidden beneath her floorboards. By the time the night of the Baron's final proposal came around, she had a small, inconspicuous vial hidden in her bodice. It was enough to incapacitate a room, or enough to stop a heart. She was ready to save Arthur, or destroy anyone who stood in her way. Chapter 15, The Break-In. She couldn't do it alone. She used her remaining influence with the servants to bribe a carriage driver to take her to the prison district. She didn't go in through the gates, she went through the sewers, following the maps Arthur had once jokingly shown her. The stench was unbearable, the water freezing, but the image of Arthur in a dark cell kept her moving. She reached the cell block, her hands shaking as she pulled the vial from her dress. She poured the liquid onto the lock, waiting for the chemical reaction to eat through the iron. Chapter 16, The Reunion. The door groaned and swung open. Arthur was slumped in the corner, his shirt torn, his body beaten, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. He wasn't surprised. He looked at her as if she were the only thing that made sense in a world of cruelty. "I told you there was no going back," he rasped, struggling to his feet. He leaned on her, his weight heavy, his strength failing. "You came," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "You really came." Chapter 17, The Escape. They moved through the shadows of the prison like ghosts. The guards were slumped over in the hallway, courtesy of the potent sedative Evelyn had released into the ventilation. As they emerged into the alleyway, the cold London rain greeted them like a blessing. They didn't head for Mayfair, they couldn't. They headed for the docks, where a ship was preparing to leave for the colonies in the morning. They were outlaws now, stripped of titles, reputation, and security, but for the first time, they were free. Chapter 18, The Final Confrontation. They were cornered at the harbour by the Duke and his men. The Duke stood on the pier, his pistol levelled at Arthur's chest. "You think you can just leave?" the Duke sneered, his eyes filled with venom. "You have ruined her, and you will pay for it." Evelyn didn't wait. She stood in front of Arthur, her hand hidden in her coat, holding the last of her concoction. "You don't own me, father," she said, her voice steady. "And if you want to keep your legacy, you will let us go." She didn't need to use the poison. She had already sent a letter to the press detailing the Duke's own involvement in the illegal trade of colonial goods. A secret he had tried to hide for years. Chapter 19, The Choice. The Duke faltered, the realization of his own ruin settling in. He knew that if he fired, the letter would be published the next morning. He lowered the pistol, his face aging 10 years in a second. He turned his back, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. Evelyn and Arthur climbed onto the deck of the ship, as it pulled away from the London pier. She watched the city fade into the mist, the home she had once thought was a sanctuary now nothing more than a memory of a cage. Chapter 20, A World Unseen. The voyage was long, but the deck of the ship became their new laboratory. They were heading to a place where the plants grew in shades of color no Londoner had ever imagined, where the secrets of the world were not hidden in books, but growing in the wild. Arthur sat beside her, his health returning, his eyes no longer cold, but filled with a new kind of wonder as he looked at her. So, Miss St. Clair, he said, taking her hand. What shall we discover first? Evelyn looked out at the horizon, at a future that was entirely, dangerously, and beautifully their own. Everything, she replied.